Okay, let's take a look at your slides. Going through the slides, it looks like you're trying to briefly introduce students into two concepts. One is worked example, and the other is working memory or cognitive load. So you have a definition and its implication here, and you have examples to show what the worked example looks like. This would be a great visual aid for this part right here. It also goes along with this text here, but if that's the case, combining this graphic with the text, this text and previous text may be a better idea. So rather than showing or explaining this definition in two steps, step 1 and step 2, you might want to combine them together and do something like this. So it's a step-by-step demonstration of, you could also add this text effective in teaching complex problem solving skills on this slide, to this slide, or you can just mention it. And now you are moving on to the definition of cognitive load. For a better understanding of the concept, I think it's a really good idea to differentiate between intrinsic cognitive load you're talking about here and extraneous cognitive load. And also, I think it's important to differentiate between germane cognitive load and the other two cognitive loads. Yes, cognitive load is a total amount of mental effort being used in the working memory. How these three types of cognitive loads are totaled makes a big difference. So try to show examples of each cognitive load by using some visuals. And here as well, if your students already know a lot about these three types of cognitive loads, this diagram will make a good sense. But for those who are not really sure about what they are, what the differences are, and so on, this diagram will be very difficult to understand. Yes, it is true, this should make sense if you combine this and this together. But for those who are new to this idea, expecting them to be able to process this by referring back to the information here when it is no longer visible on the screen, it's going to be extremely tough. Here you are referring to the three major sources of information, and visual and audible are intuitive enough, but internal combined with this image might be a little hard to understand. And also overload can occur by presenting too much irrelevant information as well. Getting back to the internal type, I think it'd be a better idea to show examples of these three types of information sources. So if you have a picture of someone, for instance, you can provide an example by drawing a picture like this. So this is an example of a visual, and this is audible. And by internal, I think when you mean this, the mental database or personal knowledge base. And I think this drawing will actually go better with what you're saying here. Basically, you're saying you can overload our mind through three types of information: visual, internal, and audible, or three channels: visual, internal, audible. And you can talk about that by showing this picture. And my drawing is not so good, so she's not overwhelmed. But you can draw a picture of a girl being overwhelmed, and that way it would make more sense. I wonder if you're just planning on reading these 5 items word by word, but the better approach would be showing examples of these and explain these 5 methods of techniques of reducing the cognitive load. Even when you think the text alone should make sense, you still want to use visuals. You still want to use graphics. There are two reasons. For one, it creates a deeper learning, but what's equally important is the retention and retrieval. People can remember what they learned better afterwards if you combine graphics with text. So if you ask your students a couple days later about 5 different ways to minimize cognitive overload, if you just show text, chances are they're not going to remember all 5. But if you combine the message with the pictures or graphics, then chances are they will probably remember more and more clearly. Or it could be a matter of how fast they can remember. Either way, retrieval can be much easier. So try showing examples, at least one example for each, and use graphics and pictures. Okay. If this is simply a refresher of a memory, as everybody already know about this thing, then this is fine. But if you're going to teach something new in here, then just writing this is not going to be enough as a visual aid. And this picture is not really helping or argumenting what the text is trying to communicate. I mentioned the same thing in relation to the screencast. You if you can come up with descriptive graphics instead of symbolic graphic pictures, descriptive pictures should be your first choice in many cases. If you really want to explain this in class, in your presentation, you're making a few points here. Working memory is your short-term memory. Okay, so that's first point. Maybe this part doesn't need further explanation, but the second part, it is what is important to know right now. What do you mean by that? Maybe you should give some example here. Then the third part, learning uses working memory. In what way? How does it work? You definitely need explanations here. Retention and retrieval require long-term memory. Okay, but why? How does it work? If your students already know the answers to these questions, then that's fine. But chances are they do need explanations. Your students, who are actually your classmates, they should know something about working memory or capacity limits of working memory. But what's here is something new, something different. Something I didn't talk about in my video. Right, now let's move on. The next part, you are presenting guidelines for teaching with worked example. Okay, so you are showing a listed items, and it's okay to use the listed items as long as you're going to be explaining each afterwards in more detail. Otherwise, you should show at least one example for each as you explain each guideline. Now let's talk about the graphic design part of your slides. I would say the text size is fine, it's decent. It's 30 and the font is this. Okay, it's a relatively larger font, so 30 with this font is probably large enough for everybody in the room. When I move on to this slide, I kind of think this image could be larger. You have more space on the right side, so you can move your text and create more space for the graphic. But still, I think this approach is better here. And remember, having multiple background colors could be extraneous elements. So in my example, there's only one color, which is white. But in your case, you have a white background for this and a purple background for this. And this is a heading, so it could be okay. But you have 1, 2, 3 different colors, background colors, as opposed to one I have. So the brain processes 2 extra elements in your case. And in my case, the brain processes 2 less elements. So it's more efficient. And same with here. Now the text size is actually small. You can't really expect everyone for people sitting 9 to 10 feet away to be able to read tiny fonts like this. If you're gonna use this image, you might wanna test the upper limit of the image size. Maybe you might wanna make it as large as this. It will make it easy to read from far behind. Inevitably, you need to move the text box a little bit, and also the text size here is 20 as opposed to 30 you used earlier, and 20 will be a little too small for people sitting far back. So you might want to use 30 for here as well. And you probably don't need a bullet item here because there's only one item. So now you have more space now. Now it's kind of cluttered. There's so many things here. Let's clean up a little bit. Okay, so this is after I clean it up. Now, it's much simpler, but still retains the same amount of information. But one thing that's not here anymore is a title, cognitive load. I moved it to a previous slide. And in your presentation, you didn't use a transitional slides like this, but it's also this is a good approach to help your students create a mental organization while viewing your presentation. So using a transition slide like this, then getting into the main content. And here, only thing you're showing is the main idea, not the title anymore. You're not going to be talking about the title anymore, so it doesn't really matter anymore. Instead, you want your students to focus on the exact thing you're explaining and illustrating here, and everything else doesn't have to be here. So this really simple slide is based on the same idea, same concept and approach. Now you can kind of tell what you can do. You don't need the title anymore, so you can get rid of it. Then you can make the image as large as it can be without interfering anything in your presentation. And I think in this case you can stretch it to fill the whole screen, and you don't even need the border around the image anymore. So you can crop it out. Then you can also use a plain white background. Then adjust the position of the image, and this is the only thing you need to explain this. So you don't need the background color. You don't need a second background color around an image. You don't need you don't need a heading. If you have taken this approach, this has no distraction. And now you're talking about cognitive overload, so you could create a new transition slide and put cognitive overload. Then getting into the main idea. and you could use a picture like this to illustrate and explain what could cause cognitive overload. But if you decide to use this format, then what you can do is try to reduce the extra unnecessary elements, and try to also increase the contrast. Black over purple, maybe not. And the font size, 24, maybe too small. 30 is probably okay. It will fit. When it comes to sizing, you need to always test the upper limit of the max optimum size. Obviously, you can't use 60 here. That's not the maximum optimum size for the text. I think 48 might do. No, probably not. How about 40? Okay, it's still too large. You won't have any more space for the graphics. So you need to test out 32. How about the 32? The font size and graphic size, and you need to test out the sizes for the fonts and graphics. And when I say test out, you need to actually put it on the main presentation monitor screen and stand 9 to 10 feet away and make sure you can actually read it. Make sure the recognition of the surface text meaning is effortless. You really don't want your students to make an extra effort just to read the text and see the details of the graphics. You want your students to use that effort for deeper understanding the important messages and content. So same with these 3 slides. Try to come up with ways to minimize and reduce the unnecessary elements. It could be a color, it could be a font size, it could be some graphics, it could be background colors, it could be a weak contrast, and so on. Okay, so make sure you ask me questions if you have any questions about my comments and feedback.